Imagine losing every memory you've ever captured, your childhood photos, your family moments, your happiest days, gone. Not because they were deleted, not because they were damaged, but because the company that helped you capture them disappeared. Now imagine something even stranger. What if I told you the company that lost everything was the same company that actually invented the future of photography? A company that had the power, the technology, and the opportunity to dominate the digital world, but instead chose not to. This is not just a story about business failure. This is a story about hesitation, about fear, about what happened when success becomes a trap. Because for decades, Kodak was not just a company. It was memory itself. Every birthday, every holiday, every once-in-a-lifetime moment was captured through Kodak. It was trusted. It was everywhere. It was unstoppable. Until one day, it wasn't. And the most shocking part? Kodak didn't lose to a competitor. It lost to a future it had already created. So, how does a company go from controlling the world to becoming a warning? Let's find out. To understand the fall, we first need to understand the power Kodak once had. Because before the collapse, there was dominance so complete, it felt permanent. The story begins in the late 1800s. At that time, photography was not simple. It was complex, expensive, and limited to professionals. Ordinary people didn't take photos. They posed for them, carefully, rarely, and often only once in a lifetime. Then came George Eastman, a man who believed something radical. That photography should not belong to experts. It should belong to everyone. So in 1888, he introduced a camera that changed history. Small, portable, and easy to use. And with it came a message that changed everything. You press the button, we do the rest. It was simple, but it was revolutionary. Because it removed the biggest barrier, complexity. For the first time, people could capture their own lives. Moments became memories. Memories became photographs. And photography became part of everyday life. But Kodak didn't stop there. They built something far more powerful, a complete system. They sold the camera, they sold the film, and they handled the development, which meant every single photo taken generated continuous income. It was not just a product, it was a recurring revenue machine, and it worked perfectly. By the early 1900s, Kodak had already begun dominating the industry. By the mid-20th century, it had no real competition. Kodak film was everywhere, used by families, used by professionals, used by governments. It became a global standard. And more importantly, it became emotional. People didn't just use Kodak, they trusted it. They associated it with memories, with nostalgia, with life itself. And that emotional connection made Kodak almost impossible to replace. For decades, Kodak wasn't just leading the market, it was the market. Now here's where the story takes a turn. In 1975, inside Kodak, something incredible happened. An engineer named Steven Sasson built the world's first digital camera. It was far from perfect. It was heavy, slow, and the image quality was poor. But none of that mattered, because what it represented was a completely new future. A future without film, a future where photos would be stored digitally, viewed instantly, shared instantly. No waiting, no processing, no physical limitations. Sasson understood this. He knew this was the beginning of something massive, so he presented it to Kodak executives, and their reaction: silence, followed by concern, because they immediately saw the problem. Digital photography would destroy their business. No film sales, no processing fees, no recurring income. Everything that made Kodak powerful would disappear. So instead of leading the future, Kodak made a decision. They suppressed it. They treated digital as a threat, not an opportunity. They believed the world would not change so quickly. They believed film would remain dominant, and they believed they had time. But time was exactly what they didn't have. By the 1990s, the world was clearly shifting. Technology was advancing rapidly. Personal computers were becoming common, the internet was growing, and digital innovation was accelerating. Photography was no longer isolated. It was becoming part of a connected world, and other companies saw it. Companies like Sony and Canon began investing heavily in digital cameras. They were not protecting the past. They were building the future. They moved faster. They experimented more. They improved technology rapidly. But Kodak continued hesitating. They tried small digital initiatives, but they never fully committed, because their film business was still making billions. And that created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that nothing needed to change. But in reality, everything was already changing. Customers were slowly shifting. Behavior was evolving. Expectations were rising. And Kodak was reacting instead of leading. And in technology, being late is often the same as losing. Then came the final blow. The early 2000s, digital cameras improved dramatically. They became affordable, they became accessible, and then something even bigger happened. Smartphones entered the market, and everything changed. Because now, the camera was always with you. No extra device, no additional cost. Just one simple action. Click, capture, share instantly. Photography was no longer a process. It became a habit. And Kodak's entire system became irrelevant overnight. Film, not needed. Processing, not needed. Waiting, no longer acceptable. Kodak tried to adapt. They released digital cameras. They attempted to compete, but they were too late. Because the game had changed. It was no longer about hardware. It was about software, about ecosystems, about platforms. And Kodak was not built for that world. Year after year, their revenue declined. Market share collapsed, and the company that once dominated the world lost its position completely. In 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. It wasn't just a financial failure. It was the end of an era. Kodak's failure was not about technology. It was about decisions. They had innovation. They had resources. They had the future in their hands. But they chose not to act. Why? Because they were afraid. Afraid of losing their existing business, afraid of change, afraid of uncertainty, and that fear led to hesitation. Their biggest mistakes were clear. Overconfidence, slow execution, internal resistance, and a focus on protecting the past. But the deepest problem was mindset. Kodak didn't think like an innovator anymore. It thought like a protector. And in a rapidly changing world, that is dangerous. Kodak's story teaches us something powerful. Success is never permanent. No matter how dominant you are, the market can change. And when it does, you must change with it. Innovation alone is not enough. You must act on it. You must be willing to disrupt yourself before someone else does. And most importantly, never become too comfortable. Because comfort is often the beginning of decline. The companies that survive are not the strongest. They are the ones that adapt fastest. Today, Kodak still exists, but not as the giant it once was. It stands as a reminder, a warning, a lesson that even the most powerful companies can fall. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they stopped evolving. So the real question is, what if Kodak had embraced digital early? Would it still be leading today? Or was this outcome inevitable? Let me know what you think. And if you enjoy deep business stories like this, subscribe to Money Machine Stories. Because behind every success, there is a strategy. And behind every failure, there is a lesson waiting to be learned.